Hi, this is Justin Colletti of SonicScoop, and today, thanks to our friends at Eventide, we get to take a closer look at a totally new type of bus compressor called Invigorate. Invigorate's the latest plugin from Newfangled Audio, which is a pretty cool brand. If you haven't heard of them yet, they've been making plugins like Saturate, Punctuate, a transient shaper, Elevate, which they call a mastering limiter with a brain, and Equivocate, which is a really interesting EQ that they call a human ear EQ. And today we're taking a closer look at this one, Invigorate, which is a bus compressor, but it really doesn't work like any other bus compressor I've ever used before, and you can get some really interesting results out of it. In a nutshell, what makes this one unique, what makes it different, what makes it special, is that it really allows you to control the character of the compressor. Part of what we're looking for when we're doing compression is dynamic range control, making things more consistent in level. But another big part of compression, especially bus compression, is the tone of the compressor. Even maybe call them the artifacts or side effects of the compressor. Like that's where so much of the mojo of a compressor lives. And with most of the bus compressors out there, they kind of have their one general tone. You either like that bus compressor or you don't, and you try another one. But Invigorate is more of a chameleon of a bus compressor, where you can get all sorts of different byproducts and side effects of compression and limiting, and kind of tailor them to taste. Instead of having a box of crayons, a whole bunch of different bus compressors that each have their own tone, this is like having your own painter's palette, where you get to pick the type of compression and the type of compression side effects you want to be most dominant to get exactly the tone and color you want. But in addition to being really flexible, it's also like extremely simple to use. We'll go over the controls here real quick, and there's only a handful of them. So we'll get playing around with it. We'll hear it together on some tracks. Before we do, let's take a quick look together at the layout. I've got Invigorate pulled up right here from Newfangled Audio. They're making great plugins and audio tools that can really do things that can only be done in the digital domain. This line of plugins was created by a guy named Dan Gillespie, who was for 15 years a DSP designer for Eventide. And he wanted to start his own line of plugins that are distributed through Eventide. So you can check them out over at newfangledaudio.com or eventideaudio.com. And you can see that right here in the center of the plugin is a control that looks like probably nothing you've ever seen in a compressor plugin before. I don't know how you describe it. It looks a little bit like a pie slice or maybe a radar readout. And a lot of the heart and soul of what's going on in Invigorate happens right here. You can basically tailor between three general different types of dynamic range control. They're called compress, limit, and overdrive. Going up and down with this dot here will allow you to control the intensity, just how much dynamic range control you're applying. Whereas going more to the left gives you some of those characteristic side effects and byproducts of compression, like pumping and breathing, and going more to the right gives you some more of those characteristic side effects and byproducts of overdrive or clipping. As you get closer to the center, you start to blend these two styles of dynamic range processing, getting a type of dynamic range control that sounds a lot more like we think of a limiter sounding like. And that's really the main thrust of what's going on in Invigorate. There are a few different ways that compressors on the bus can change the character of our overall sound. When we lean more towards the compress side on this, we're getting what's fairly clean sounding dynamic control, but we might get some more of those side effects of that really pleasant pumping and breathing that really helps a mix kind of gel together. Now, obviously, excessive pumping and breathing can be a problem and can sound annoying, but a little bit of it is kind of what can make mixes seem to really shimmer and shine and feel cohesive and glued together, and like everything in there just belongs in the same world, that they're kind of moving together with a similar pulse. So this is one of the aspects of compression that people really like on the mix bus. As we go over to the other side for overdrive, we get more of that kind of clipping sound. Really, you can describe it as saturation, where we're adding upper harmonics, ideally pleasant sounding upper harmonics that add some character and grit and girth to the sound. And without any of these added harmonics, sometimes our mixes can sound a little bit sterile. But I also think that adding common harmonics across an entire mix is another part of what gives us that glued together sound that we get out of a good mix bus compressor. That every element in there is being treated in kind of the same way, getting the same harmonic extension applied to it. And it can really help make things sound like they're coming from the same world together. In just a minute, we'll hear in action together the differences in tone between going more towards the compressed side and more towards the overdrive side. But in addition to changing between the blend between these two types of character and the intensity of these two types of character, we can also dial in our preferred settings for the compression characteristics and for the overdrive characteristics. And that brings us to the controls down at the bottom, which are pretty simple and easy to use. You can almost think of these controls on the left-hand side as controlling the compression characteristics, and you can kind of think of these controls on the right-hand side as controlling the overdrive characteristics. On the left, we've got the kinds of things you'd expect to see on a compressor: attack, release, and a sidechain filter to help keep some of the extreme low end from being the only thing triggering your compressor. On the right, we can adjust the distortion curve of this overdrive saturation section. This shape knob kind of acts like a knee control would, changing the shape of our dynamics curve between more of a soft knee and a hard knee kind of approach. And when we really push this, we're going to hear just how much of an effect this shape control can have. We can also change the shape of this curve with this squash control, and this also has a big impact on the type of saturation and harmonic addition we're getting as we add more and more overdrive or saturation. Finally, there's also a gate available here, which is kind of like a downward expander, where a compressor takes the loudest signals and turns them down. This gate function will take the quietest bits of audio and turn them down further. So if you're using this on an individual instrument, say to squash a snare drum, but you want to control some of that cymbal bleed in the back of a snare drum, turning up this gate control will take those quiet bits of bleed and turn them down further. So you're not just bringing up a whole bunch of noise and bleed along with the parts of the signal that you actually want. Finally, in the center, there's this output section. And the big thing here is the mix control, which is one of the most important parts of Invigorate. The way Invigorate works, you almost want to set it completely wet, drive it too far, but to a place where it sounds really cool, and then dial back on the amount of dynamics processing you're applying. Some of the controls you'll notice aren't in here are things like threshold and ratio, and there's a good reason for that. A lot of that is basically taken care of for you by this mix knob. There is a fixed threshold in this compressor, just like there would be in something like an 1176 or an LA2A, and there's basically a fixed ratio as well. But the reality is that by turning down this mix control, you are effectively turning down the ratio, because what's happening is you're taking a severely compressed signal and combining it with a totally uncompressed signal. And the sum of those two parts is basically compression with a reduced ratio. Mind kind of blown, but that's really how it works under the hood. Another interesting thing that Dan from Newfangled Audio is telling me is that basically all these types of dynamics processing, compression, limiting, saturation, clipping, overdrive, distortion, they're basically all the same type of processor, playing by a slightly different set of rules. And with these controls on the left or right, we get to kind of change that set of rules, or at least morph it to our liking. And then with this graphical display up top, we get to increase or decrease the intensity and tilt towards which set of rules, which types of dynamic control characteristics we want to add more or less of to the signal. Now, because there's a fixed threshold here, and because blending between the compressed signal and the raw signal is such an important part of the way this tool is used, there are a couple more features here. One is that under the hood of Invigorate, there is probably some of the best sounding auto gain compensation I've ever heard. Best sounding in the respect that it actually works, meaning that it reduces output gain or increases output gain appropriately in ways that really do feel level matched properly. This is something that a lot of compressor plugins that have an auto gain function kind of get wrong, but this is probably one of the most accurate ones I've heard. But enough of me talking about the philosophy and use case and how the thing works. Let's actually hear it on some tracks together. I've got a few great tracks here pulled up from some clients of mine. I picked some kind of in the electronic genre, maybe with a little bit of a hip-hop groove and undercurrent in some of these, because I just felt like that would be the kind of material to show off some of this newfangled stuff on. But of course, you could use this in any genres. It would work just as well on rock and pop and singer-songwriter and metal and hip-hop or whatever. But let's dive into these. I'm going to take this thing back to its factory defaults, and we'll just play around with it together, hearing how it sounds in this clean compressing mode and in this dirtier overdrive saturation mode. And then once we've dialed in some interesting sounds there, we'll tone it down by dragging this mix control way down. Let's go ahead and hear it. First, I'll play it on a song by a client of mine called Woodz Deep. Great artist who's had me master a bunch of tracks from. I have not yet mastered this one called Never the Past. So we're hearing basically the raw mix here. I've maybe applied a tiny touch of EQ to take it a little more in the direction I might after mastering. But that's it. The only plugin I have up here right now is Invigorate. Let's go. And I think you can hear this thing really come to life, even when I have the mix knob just here at 30%, or even if I turn it down even further, it's just a little more alive sounding when I engage it. And this is again level matched before and after. You'll notice we're actually applying a ton of compression here. I believe something like 11 dB of compression or more might have been happening on this meter. But as we dial back this mix control further and further, and we start to get down to the 20s or the teens, it effectively is giving us a much smaller amount of compression and a lot closer to what you might use on a mix bus. But I really like this idea of going in there and by default, pushing things super hard, hearing exactly the characteristics of the compression and of the saturation, hearing exactly how it's changing. Are we getting a really buzzy sounding saturation? Are we getting a smoother sounding saturation? Let's dial between the two of those. Let's go over to compression. Are we getting a really snappy and tight sounding compression? Or do we want a kind of compression that's going to swallow our attack and make things sound thicker and duller? And then let's go ahead and back this way down. So we've listened to the effects of our compression and saturation almost under a microscope, really hearing what's going on with them and then dialing them way back to a point where it's tasteful instead of overdone. Just so we're not listening to the same track the whole time, I'll bring up another track from an artist here. Sent me this one called Change from an artist called Shockbroker. He was a little unhappy with the results he was getting mastering his own tracks for himself, so he sent this one to me to see what I could do with it. Before I actually do any real mastering on it, I just wanted to take this raw mix and put it through Invigorate and see what Invigorate can do to it. Let's check this track out again first in its factory default settings. This time, in addition to playing around with the shape on the saturation, I'll also play around with the attack and release on the compressor side. So cool. It's just a way to make things sound a little bit more alive. Go in there, tailor exactly the kinds of artifacts, side effects, compression, byproducts we want. Hear those in some pretty extreme detail and then dial it back to taste. I'm going ahead and hitting the threshold pretty hard here. On material this hot, you could go ahead and just bring your input down by 6 dB or 12 dB, and then bring your output up by 6 dB or 12 dB to compensate. So that way, you wouldn't necessarily be hitting the threshold quite so hard and can have less compression going on before you even start reducing the mix control. But for the purposes of demonstration, I thought it'd be fun to push this thing really hard. But of course, you don't have to use this only on full mixes. You can use it on individual instruments like snare drum or a bass or a vocal, or you can use it on buses like drum bus. Let's take the isolated drum stems from this particular track and hear how Invigorate sounds on them. And I think you can hear, even with just crazy amounts of compression and saturation applied, it still sounds kind of cool. And you can get carried away with dialing in just how those particular byproducts and side effects are going to sound, and then scoot them back. And even with the mix knob down pretty far, when we get into the teens, 20s, which is probably where I would most often use this kind of extreme bus compression settings that I've been dialing in, we still get a sense for it bringing the track a little bit more to life, getting a little bit more perceived level and loudness, and hearing a little bit more detail in the track. Because that's one of the great things that happens with well-used bus compression, is some of those little trailing bits, the sustain of cymbals, the tails of reverbs and delays, all those little details just get amplified a little bit more and help give you a little bit more of a three-dimensional, glued together kind of sound. Now, as I said, I've been pushing this thing pretty hard. A lot of the time we've been listening to it, there's been 12 dB of gain reduction or more. And I'm pushing it into some pretty gnarly, over-the-top kinds of processing. But you could certainly use this much more subtly if you wanted to, by backing off even further on the mix knob, by reducing your input even further and increasing your output gain a little bit more. And the more that you really get to know this tool by pushing it to its extremes, the more you're going to be able to use it much more subtly and have a good sense of what it's going to do to your audio in each of these different settings. And I think this is not only a great tool for getting some really interesting sounds out of bus compression, but for also learning about compression and bus compression. The fact that it's doing this level matching so well for you is a great way to start to learn to hear the effects of compression. Just getting this tool, setting the compression section to stun, and playing around with attack and release and having it automatically apply some makeup gain for you will help train your ear a lot for learning what different attack and release settings sound like. The same is true for the overdrive section. Setting this thing to stun over here and playing around with the shape can give you a good sense for exactly what things like a knee control are doing to your audio. The controls are ultimately extremely simple, but we've only really just scratched the surface here when it comes to the kinds of sounds you can get out of this thing. By doing things as simple as adjusting your attack time, your release time, your shape, your squash, you can get massively different results. But the best way to hear this thing is to hear it for yourself. Go over to newfangledaudio.com or eventideaudio.com, where you can try out this or anything else that Newfangled Audio makes for free for 30 days. This plugin has just come out, and this is one of the first videos out there about it. If you've gotten a chance to try it out for yourself, I want to hear from you in the comments down below. Were you able to get some useful, interesting, and fun results out of this thing? What were some of your favorite applications for it? Were you using it on mix bus in a mastering context? Were you using it on individual instruments or groups like drums or bass or vocals? Let us know in the comments down below. I read every single one of them and respond when I can. Big thanks again to Newfangled Audio and Eventide Audio for sending this over to us and allowing us to try it out. They've been longtime friends and supporters of the channel, so big shout out to those guys. Definitely check out their plugins if you haven't already. Thanks again for hanging out with me on the SonicScoop YouTube channel. This has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. See you next time.